Everyone, we have over 500 people registered for today's conversation, and we see a lot of people just entering into the Zoom room. So we're going to give everyone just a minute or two longer to get connected so they don't miss out on any of today's conversation. So hang tight and we will get started in just a moment.
Okay, my post is out.
That's an F-16.
All right, welcome everyone. We have got just everyone getting connected to our Zoom presentation today. We have over 500 people registered for today's conversation, so we're going to just ask you to sit tight for a second while we get everyone connected to the Zoom room. While you are joining us, I will ask if you could kindly make sure that your phone and your line is on mute. That would be really helpful. Otherwise, we'll jump in and try to mute all of you. We know you've still got kids, family, dog, loved ones in the background, and we just want to make sure that we can hear all of our presenters today. So hang tight for just another minute and we will get started shortly.
Okay, so I'm on mute, right? It says mute.
I don't know.
Whoever that was, no, you are not on mute. All right, we have got just about everyone entered. All right, we're going to go ahead and get things started if that's all right with everyone. I'm just going to change this. All right, welcome everyone to today's presentation. My name is Jennifer Thompson and I am the Executive Director of NASW New Jersey. And we are so excited to have you here for today's conversation on reopening, return to in-person practice in light of COVID. I think we can all agree to some extent we're ready to embark on this return and understand a little bit more about what that will look like and how we should be operating as social workers post COVID and quarantine. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we turn today's conversation over to our presenters. First and foremost, we are going to ask that everyone stay on mute if you can, with over 500 participants in our live stream. It is incredibly important that we stay muted so that we don't hear your dogs, your cats, your kids, all of the stuff that's still happening in your background around you. We are also going to ask for our Facebook viewers. This is a live simulcast. If you have questions on Facebook, please chat them in the Facebook stream there, and we've got people monitoring that. And when it's appropriate for questions, we will be asking them from both the room here and from our Facebook live stream. If you have a question for our presenters, which I'm sure many of you will have, there will certainly be time for that shortly. I will just ask if you could quickly chat that to us and chat it to myself, Jeff, or Helen on the line. That would be great. We're in communication with one another and we'll be able to ask the question on your behalf. You can also raise your virtual yellow hand if you prefer to do that, and we can call on you. Just as a couple of reminders, when you did register for today's conversation, you did agree to some code of conduct, some rules of the road, as you will have it, for how we conduct ourselves in the chat room. We do encourage you all to chat and have conversation. But we ask that you please don't share personal contact information in the chat room as it is open for everyone, and just make sure that we're keeping the conversation professional and geared to the topic at hand. Not that we like to, but if we have to, we do reserve the right to remove individuals from the Zoom presentation if we so see that is necessary. I'm sure we won't, we've never had to do it, but just like to go through a couple of those disclaimers at first. So with that, we're going to jump into today's conversation. We are so grateful to have experts in our field in ethics and law and in the profession of social work. David Berry, who's the past president of NASW New Jersey, a social worker and an attorney, as well as Chris Hare, who also shares the same titles. Chris also sits on our ethics committee, and many of you know her from a couple of ethics presentations that we've done recently. You know, there is a lot changing in the world of COVID and reopening, and a lot of it is confusing and is changing day by day, it seems. New Jersey has been very strict about our rules and very clear on our guidance. And just recently, the governor has issued a set of executive orders opening us back up. But how that doesn't speak to a lot of the issues that we have as social workers. Where do we fall in that conversation? Are we healthcare professionals? Are we businesses? Are we office settings? And today we're going to dive into some of those questions, but also talk about the ethics of returning to in-person work and hopefully provide some clarity and some guidance as you move forward in returning back to the office. So with that said, welcome. David and Chris, thank you so much for agreeing to share your knowledge and your expertise with us and have a conversation. I look forward to it. So I thought we would start a little bit today on just a few starter questions, hopefully get some of the big ones that we've heard over the past couple of weeks out of the way. And then we'll dive into some questions from the audience if that's okay with you all. David, Chris, that okay with you? I see you in two different spots on my Zoom screen. Great. So I'm Chris and David. I'm interested from both of you all from a legal perspective. What things should practitioners be thinking about as they start to return to seeing people in person, or even consider opening up their offices for in-person work?
Before we even begin that, and I'm sure David was planning on saying this too, but we are ethically required to say that nothing that we say on this presentation today should be construed as legal advice, because when you're talking about legal issues, everything is very case specific, fact specific. Also, the fact that if we have people on this call that are from outside of the state of New Jersey, their laws, their reopening plan, you know, is probably different from, well, their laws certainly may be different, and their reopening plan may also be different than what's going on here today, June 1st in the state of New Jersey. Okay, so I think we just, you know, had to state that before we even speak. Is that right, David?
Yeah, well said, Chris. You said exactly what I was going to. Also, I would add that while I suspect the majority of the attendees are in private practices, private clinical practices, to the extent that you are working in an agency, to the extent you're working in a non-private practice setting, check with your risk management people, your legal staff, and so on. I would certainly follow their guidance. This is necessarily general in nature. And again, as Chris correctly said, facts matter, and the facts governing your particular practice, your particular issues really deserve a specific analysis. So this is intended as guidance. I was thinking of an analogy to start, you know, helping you find our way through the desert or the ocean. The problem with those analogies is you can see clearly in a desert or an ocean. Here we're kind of hacking our way through a thick forest of rules and regulations. And every time you think you've cut one down, another one has grown. So with that analogy in mind, we're going to try to help us generally steer through the forest.
Thanks, David. So Well, one of the things that I would, I guess, start and say is that every social worker should be reading and keeping up with the latest information that you're receiving from your state, your governor, your Department of Health, as well as the information that we're receiving on a national level. And I know this stuff comes quickly and it comes a lot and it changes frequently, but we're going to be responsible for knowing a lot of this information. And the only way to know it is to keep up with it. So if you get something in the mail from your state or from your local NASW, don't kind of put that off until later. Read it, try and understand what it's saying and think about how does this apply to my practice, my agency. Then if you have questions, and you probably will, that's the time to go further and ask someone in your agency, someone in risk management, even calling up whoever is your insurance carrier. All right, because everything that I've read so far does make that recommendation. Contact your carrier, see what they say about doing this or not doing that. So I think the first thing is to start and educate yourself based on the information that's being readily made available to us.
Great, thank you, Chris. Certainly reading the information is critical. David, do you have anything else? Any thoughts on where people should start?
Well, I do think reading a variety of sources, I'd recommend, I'm not sure the exact URL, but it's the COVID-19 site for New Jersey. And there you will find all the various executive orders. I also think you'd be well advised to look at the CDC guidance. Look at the EEOC site on COVID and the Americans with Disability Act site. Part of the caution I'm going to throw out there, after discussing these two kind of dueling executive orders that came out of Trenton last week, that are the source of some confusion for social workers, another caution I'd add is that the EEOC and the ADA have not yet updated their regulations. The EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is very concerned with the rights of workers in the workplace, and they have the authority to issue regulations regarding things such as masking, social distancing, and so on. They haven't spoken yet. They are a valid and important source of authority. So again, I urge caution. The Americans with Disability Act has not yet issued regulations. They are more focused on your clients, your consumers, and they have a legitimate and important voice in this conversation. They have not spoken yet. So again, I urge caution. At the risk of making everyone's eyes glaze over, let me talk briefly about what I will call the dueling executive orders that came out of Trenton last week. As Chris correctly said, all these laws and regulations are state specific. We are only talking about New Jersey right now. Executive Order 242 came out on Monday of last week. It basically said, hey, almost all businesses in New Jersey, if you're vaccinated, you're cool. You can drop the mask mandate for your customers. You can maintain social distancing, unless you, the owner, chooses differently. But basically, life returns to normal. Executive Order 242, issued on Monday of last week, said, but there's an exception. And the exception potentially probably applies to private practice social workers and other mental health practitioners. It says that there is a group of indoor workspaces of employers that don't open their indoor spaces to the public for the purposes of sales of goods, attends at an event or activity, or the provision of services. So basically, Executive Order 242 lifts the mask mandate for employers that are open to the public. That's not us. We're not, in the traditional sense, open to the public. You make appointments, people come to see you. Hopefully it's in a very limited and controlled fashion, right? So on its face, one could argue, and a not unreasonable interpretation of Executive Order 242 is that the drop the masks, everybody comes back from working remotely, doesn't apply to private practice therapists. Okay. While a little bit distasteful to my palate, that at least was somewhat clear. Then, however, to add to the confusion, on Friday of last week, Executive Order 243 came out and basically seemed to say, indoor public space, everybody can drop the mask. So I would urge caution. There's ambiguity. I could make a lawyerly argument pointing to prior executive orders and their definitions of healthcare services. I could point to what is and isn't listed on the CDC site to make the argument that no, mental health practitioners in non-hospital type settings should be treated along with every other businesses and therefore able to open its doors, drop the mask requirements. That's unclear. I'm a conservative guy. So between the ambiguity between these two executive orders issued last week, given the fact that the EEOC and the ADA have not updated their guidance, I think there might be wisdom in a practitioner maintaining the status quo until we get further clarification, either from the governor's office, either in the form of an executive order or some pronouncement, some guidance by perhaps in New Jersey, the Board of Social Work Examiners. Right now, there are too many ambiguities for me to say to you, go back to business as usual. I urge caution, which means masks, at least for, unless you're 6 feet or more distance with other protocols in place. Continuing to take advantage of distance therapy wherever appropriate. Observing all the other protocols for people that come into your office, social distancing, masking, and so on. So sorry for the extended soliloquy. There's just so much to process, and it's changing day by day.
Yeah, I missed part of what you said, David, because I lost internet. So I hope I'm not repeating.
I thought you said you lost interest. I thought, me too.
Internet. I wanted to add just a couple of other sources for people to look at, which would be OSHA as well as the World Health Organization. And again, these things aren't always up to date, but they certainly are sources of information. I agree with you, David, that that we still should be proceeding carefully. I think a couple of things, we have to take in mind, just in terms of, who we are and who our clients are, when making these decisions. We certainly have to look at ourselves and our own risk factors. And since the Code of Ethics recently added something about finally self-care, I think we, need to look at that, look at your own health status, your own age, safety. All right. And then also look at your client and your client's needs. We've been kind of conducting ourselves, or many have been conducting ourselves doing the online, and that's worked to some degree. I mean, getting knocked off, as just happened to me, sometimes happens. So it's not ideal, but I think, our safety and the client's safety always has to come first in regard to what our decision is going to be. And are we vaccinated? Are our clients vaccinated? And we'll probably talk shortly about, what happens if we're vaccinated and what we can or cannot do if our clients are not vaccinated or don't want to be vaccinated. That, has been a a question for many forms of business ever since this all started. So, I think that we have to take all of those things into consideration um, when kind of making those decisions, because there is that ambiguity. And so with ambiguity, sometimes we have to, just make the best decision for all persons involved. I think that's one of Rick Reamer's uh, applications of theory. Um, so
Yeah, thank you. It is really complicated, and there's so many different facets to the conversation: your health status, your client's health status, vaccination, et cetera. And there's already a ton of questions coming in. So I'm going to try to tackle a couple of them as the conversation unfolds so I don't lose sight of them. Someone had a question regarding waivers and your thoughts on, if you are to see your clients again in person, should they be signing waivers, and are they even legally enforceable? There's a lot of conversation about waivers and how they hold up. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay. I think waivers are a useful tool in the toolbox. I'd encourage everyone that is in private practice that doesn't already use one to Google, and this is the universal symbol for Googling, right? Waiver, and there are many templates out there, NASW.
Oh, the joys of Zoom and the frozen
he's back.
screen.
He's back.
Consult with an attorney if appropriate. But I think they are a good idea. Not that they are ironclad, but I think one of the primary functions of them is to enable you, the practitioner, to have a conversation with your client about coming into the office, about acknowledging that while we're pursuing various protocols, there are no guarantees, and obviously there's some potential for risk. You're aware of that. We'll take reasonable precautions. You'll take reasonable precautions. If this is uncomfortable for you, we have the availability of teletherapy. And let's have that conversation. I think that's a really good methodology for the practitioner, maybe to have that telephone conversation with the client before they come in. Because if the client is uncomfortable with the premise of the fact that there is some degree of risk, notwithstanding all of your efforts, then maybe they are a good candidate for continued teletherapy. And it enables you to get kind of a sense of their attitude towards the issue of risk, so that plans can be made in concert with one another.
There is a legal concept in torts, which is kind of personal injury, not a desert, okay? And it's called assumption of the risk. And that's really what we're kind of talking about with waivers. Now, we all already should be using informed consents, right? Where we are setting forth with our clients kind of like the terms of our work, what can be expected from us, what we expect from the client. And I think this, a waiver can be incorporated into our consents for new clients and then added on for, clients that we've been working with in an ongoing fashion. And just kind of, letting the client know that, they should be aware, we should be aware that, there's no guarantee. Even if I'm vaccinated, I can't guarantee that I'm 100%. I can't guarantee that the person who just came into my office was 100%. I certainly have obligations, and we can go into this more later, that between clients, if somebody's coming in, we have to take some kind of effort to clear the room, so to speak. Perhaps, air it out. Use I have an air cleaner, for lack of a more professional word, wiping down common areas, spraying, things like that. We have that obligation, but we can't guarantee anything. So the client assumes the risk. Now, we do this all the time. If you go to a ball game, a baseball game, your ticket, usually has some language on the back that says you're assuming the risk that you might get hit in the head with a baseball, or if you go to a concert, something could happen. It's not going to stop a lawsuit. You can get sued even if you do or don't or whatever. But, it is kind of evidence that you've kind of taken all the precautions that you can, and you've left the decision up to your client, and your client has chosen to come in. The other thing that I'll mention, again, just in the decision when we're talking about our client's needs, all right? One area where perhaps we might choose to say, with all the precautions and perhaps this waiver, that a client should come in is maybe a client that has been or could be imminently suicidal, all right? Based on, a case that held therapists to a very high standard in being able to predict somebody's suicidal behavior, which was never challenged beyond the trial court. That's one of the areas that I'm always concerned with. Klebanoff versus Marshall, I think the case was. And, that high standard, which, as I said, I think the court got it wrong on there. But, if you have somebody who's suicidal, there's a higher expectation that you're going to be monitoring very closely this particular person. So that may be an area where you might say, at this point, I need to at least do, one face-to-face to really check in and, get a full assessment. There may be other, very client-specific reasons that you want to kind of balance the telehealth versus in person, but that's certainly one area.
So another question came in, just trying to keep us in line with some of the questions in the conversation we're having. Legally, can you ask your clients if they have been vaccinated?
My understanding is you can ask them, but there are certain things that you can't ask going into detail into their health situation. But my understanding is that across the board, regardless of what the setting was, that you can ask, have you been vaccinated? Is that your understanding, David?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the ADA has ruled on that. HIPAA has said something to that effect. So have you been vaccinated? Perfectly valid question, both to employees and clients. But as Chris noted, if the answer is no, I would be wary of any follow-up questions. Well, why not? Are you an anti-vaxxer? Are you? There are many, many reasons why people may not have chosen to be vaccinated or not yet. It may be they've got a comorbidity for which it's not yet clearly prescribed. They may be planning on becoming pregnant, etc. They may have been exposed to the virus and recovered. There are all kinds of reasons. You are not permitted to go into that. So have you been vaccinated? Yes. And by the way, you can and should, with your employees particularly, get proof of vaccination. That's legitimate. Keep it separate from your other employee records, because HIPAA does not preclude you from asking those questions and getting that documentation, but HIPAA imposes some heavy burdens on you, armed with that information, to keep it secure. So keep the vaccination cards, keep that information separate and apart and under lock and key, however you choose to do that. So you can ask, go lightly thereafter.
That's great advice. Another question sort of along that same vein, if the clients have disclosed that they are not vaccinated, can you have different preferences for seeing people in person? I'm only going to see persons who are vaccinated in person. And I think that's a question from both the legal perspective, but also an ethical perspective. And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that and all of the complexities that entails.
I think this is one of the most challenging things. I think if a client is unvaccinated, and especially if the practitioner has certain risk factors, okay, even if they're vaccinated, again, it's not 100%. I think the practitioner can offer telehealth as a reasonable accommodation. You know, the question is, is whether they're vaccinated or not, is that, you know, a health status that's protected by the ADA, and in choosing only telehealth, are we discriminating? In my opinion, okay, and again, this is not legal advice, but I don't think that is a health status per se. Okay. Um, so I think that, you know, you can say, you know, for my health and for the health of the rest of my clients that are going to be walking in and out of my office, especially if your office is small, 1 or 2 rooms, that to recommend telehealth, at least for now, to continue, I think is a reasonable alternative.
This is what I would add to that. I agree with Chris. If the Executive Order 242 is still in place and it exempts private practice, social work, and other mental health therapists from its scope, the status quo ante, oh no, he's bringing in Latin, remains in place, meaning the governor's prior orders to the extent possible, have all your people working remotely still applies to us, which means teletherapy should be the norm. Now, I think that's a good rule of thumb. I appreciate, and I'm not a clinician, I appreciate that there are some clients for whom remote therapy is inappropriate. You can bring them in, obviously observing all the necessary protocols, okay? That's your professional judgment to make, but I think writ large, telehealth is still the way to go for most clients, but that's your sound clinical judgment to make.
There are a couple of questions have come in regarding the return to in-person from a practitioner's perspective. If you're a practitioner for self-care reasons, for your own sanity, your own practice, believes that you should be moving to an in-person setting, and you cannot function in the Zoom world. I totally understand. I'm over it as well. But your clients are now resistant to coming in and only want to be seen via telehealth. How do you navigate that? Can you, at this point, shut down your telehealth practice and open your doors back up and say, I'm no longer going to be providing this from a legal perspective, but also even an ethical perspective? And what do you do, or how do you navigate that after you've established a therapeutic relationship?
I think you have to, as you know, the first thing that you learn in social work school is start where the client is at. We know clinically that this pandemic has either set forth or exacerbated existing anxiety, depression, phobias, all of that. Okay. And I think both ethically, and I would also say legal, but certainly ethically, I think that we can't put this is an area where we shouldn't be putting I've had it with Zoom in front of the client's needs. If the client, is still dealing with anxiety, the anxiety has gotten worse, or, became an issue, I would say, and this isn't the most legal or ethical, but kind of like, suck it up, buttercup, really put that client's needs first for telehealth. Telehealth is not the same level of risk to the practitioner as, let's say the risk of contracting COVID by a face-to-face. So, but be working with the client and, discuss with them as that is one of their goals, about moving back into the world, post COVID, post pandemic, because that is a clinical issue. that should be worked on along with whatever they initially came in with, because, as we move forward and life gets back to normal, there are going to be people in the population that are going to really struggle with this. And so we can be helping people with that, from the get-go right now. I know folks that are dealing with it already.
This is one of the most challenging things about being a social worker, is the intersection of how we feel and our comfort level and our clients, and really navigating through some of those difficult conversations. Another question that came in sort of related to this is working with families, right? You might be working with adults who might be vaccinated, but have some family sessions or children who are not vaccinated. Thoughts on how you navigate that with some family members being vaccinated and others not, and needing to come together, or even groups who some might be vaccinated and some might not be, and how do you navigate that in group therapy?
This is an area particularly where you would want to have appropriate informed consent and waiver forms executed, and obviously in a group context or family therapy context, signed by every member of the group. And I think it's very important to do so.
Chris, I see you nodding.
Yeah, families are one thing because they've, probably created their hub. Children under a certain age can't get the vaccine at this point anyway. But if the adults are vaccinated and let's say teenagers, if there are teenagers now, are waiting for their turn to get vaccinated, it may be, if we're able to or inclined to have in-person work, that may be one thing. I think certainly the groups, it may be something, that we, again, if we are inclined and are able, depending upon the status of the law, it may be something where you want to try and do, you can test out a hybrid. You have some people who are in the group and some people are participating online. But I think you're going to have that if there may be people in the group that are willing to come in, but they they want to make sure that everybody's vaccinated, and we can't necessarily tell somebody, well, I can guarantee you everybody here is vaccinated, especially if that's not true. So that's going to be some challenges. So you have to kind of leave it to the client to decide. So I think they are kind of two different things. And even in the group, we have some people who are afraid to come back out. Some people want to, there's going to be a lot of different needs to be addressed. And that's going to be challenging. Absolutely.
The joys of social work, lots of needs, lots of different opinions. In terms of returning to in-person, one of the biggest questions that we get is that of contact tracing here in New Jersey, and our role in keeping records, disclosing records if we're called by contact tracers. What is our role if we're seeing people in person and participating in that? And also, how do you communicate with your clients that if they are test positive or exposed, that they need to communicate with you, and how you communicate that with other people? I'd love to hear your legal thoughts on some of those requirements, to the extent that we have them, because that is, from an employer's perspective, very tricky as well. I can completely empathize with anybody facing some of those questions and operational challenges.
Well, even if you say the latest executive order 243 applies to us and we're allowed to open our doors, it still requires that you observe all the other safety protocols that have long been in place. Sanitizing areas, I'd suggest, keeping clients outside until their appointment, making sure, your waiting room is separated so people aren't on top of one another, cleaning in between visits, and so on. You're also responsible under those protocols for taking people's temperature in a non-contact manner, recording names, temperatures, dates, and so on. I would encourage you to do that with employees that are physically present to maintain that log. Now, if somebody's running a fever, does that trigger your obligation as a therapist to engage in contact tracing? I suppose if you need a hobby, you could start, but I don't think the law imposes that requirement on you. In fact, I discourage you from doing it, leave it to others. You are responsible for that kind of baseline maintenance of data. And obviously, if someone's spiking a fever, I'd send them home.
Yeah. You know, all the laws that we have, you know, and even the Code of Ethics, I believe, you know, we talk about unless otherwise required by law. All right. So everything makes allowances for the law to determine that certain action has to be taken to protect a person from themselves or protect others. All right. And so I don't think it's necessarily up to us if somebody comes in with a fever to, you know, to report them, because a fever could be caused by anything. All right. But I think David's right to err on caution, you know, to not do that, to, you know, offer a telehealth. I mean, I had a doctor's appointment back in March, and this was after I had contact with my aunt. We had just taken her to a facility. She was in the facility 5 days, and I get a phone call that she tested positive. All right. How the hell that could have happened, I have no idea, but she tested positive. Right. I had a doctor's appointment scheduled that Monday. Now, I took responsibility. I didn't have a fever. I didn't have any symptoms, but I called my doctor's office and said, look, I've been exposed, it seems. And I initiated, you know, do you want to do a telehealth instead of me just coming in? Right. I thought that was the responsible thing to do. And I would like to think that all our clients would, you know, think in those terms. If they think, you know, that they're sick, if they have a fever, if they have whatever, to, you know, take that responsibility. However, we can't always rely upon that, right? So we, you know, we do have to set limits. And we, again, can offer telehealth, or, you know, I could schedule another point with you in 10 days or whatever. Or if you take a COVID test, if you choose to do that and you come up negative or whatever, let's talk. So we're not abandoning the client, which would be unethical, but we're just saying we need to, you know, put in these measures. So, you know, I think that I think again that we're being reasonable, and that's what's being asked of us, to act like a reasonable professional social worker. That's the standard.
Right. Let me just pick up on what Chris said. Reasonableness is the watchword throughout this entire conversation. Why? It's good to be a reasonable person. From a narrow crab legal perspective, though, reasonableness is the standard by which, God forbid, a lawsuit is filed arising out of COVID, someone gets sick, fingers are pointed at you. The legal standard by which your actions will be judged is, did you act reasonably? What is reasonable? It's reasonable under all the circumstances. That's going to include things like the executive orders, things like CDC guidance, things like what continuing education efforts like this are telling us. You know, and I would add to that, kind of under reasonableness, also transparency, along the lines we've discussed. That's part of reasonableness. So you don't have to be 100% right. You don't have to make in your efforts to create a safe place for your employees and your clients. You don't have to do what Dr. Fauci might. You are obliged, though, to behave in what most would agree would be a reasonable manner. And that's what we've been trying to get across to you. You don't have to be 1000% right. A lot of this is gray areas, but what are some of the reasonable steps we can take to protect our staff, our clients, and yeah, ourselves? That's not a dirty word.
And you know, the reasonable, if one were to get sued, here's what would happen. Okay. They're going to bring in somebody else, another professional social worker, who has some area of expertise in this, if they can find, an ultimate expert, because I don't think there are that many, who's going to testify. The standard, under these circumstances would be A, B, and C. You did D, E, and F. You did not meet that standard. You fell below the standard. And they're going to quote things like NASW, but their policy is from 2020. They're going to quote, as David said, the CDC. They're going to quote, OSHA. They're going to quote ADA, whatever. That's all going to come in, right? So we are obligated to find out as many standards that apply and try and meet within those standards. We may, for example, believe something personally, and you're entitled to that opinion, whether it's I don't need a mask, or whether it's I don't need to wash down, or whatever. Okay, that's what you may believe, but I would certainly go to the most recent standards that guide my professional conduct and see what they say, because that's what we're going to be judged on. Not our personal beliefs. We're not Anthony Fauci. Okay, so unless you're an epidemiologist or whatever he is, a person who's an expert in virology, if that's a word, we have to go by what's out there. Those are our standards.
Great. Reasonableness, certainly the name of this game right now, particularly as it changes every day and is often confusing. Along the same lines of confusing things that we are unsure about that are absolutely open to change at any given moment is that of insurance. And I'm going to actually ask Jeff Feldman, who's our Director of Advocacy, to speak about this. There's been a lot of questions coming into me about insurance, what we can expect, etc. And Jeff, you're here. I don't see you, but I know you are.
I am. I'm here in incognito mode, voice only. So yeah, as people have been asking, there are still a lot of questions up in the air about telehealth and what the future of the expanded telehealth options will be that were put in place during the public health emergency. We've been in regular touch with folks from the New Jersey legislature, and there are bills pending in the new state legislature right now that will work to extend a lot of the provisions that were put into effect due to COVID. A bill has passed the Senate already. There is an assembly version that is still in review, and we're hoping will be heard soon. That bill is bill number A4179. Again, A4179. And it has a number of provisions in it that are important to folks that are conducting services via telehealth. One of the provisions is that it would require insurers to allow providers to use any telehealth platform they like, as long as it's HIPAA compliant and is in compliance with CMS Medicare regulations, as opposed to folks being funneled through Teladoc and other systems that insurers might have set up. There's also provisions that would require telehealth to continue to be paid at parity and covered at parity with other in-person services. So if it's a service that an insurer is covering in person, this legislation, if passed, would ensure that that insurance is just as easily accessible and reimbursable through telehealth as it is for in-person. There's also a couple of other provisions that we've asked to be added to A4179. And anybody on this call can reach out to their legislators and also ask them to support A4179 with the added provisions. One of the things that we've asked for them to return to the bill is language that would allow for the coverage of audio-only telehealth services. As many of you know, it took a long time for CMS Medicare office to allow for audio only services, and they did eventually allow for that for Medicare services. And following that, many private entities also followed and allowed audio only services. That provision was struck from the Senate bill that passed due to pushback from the insurance lobby. Again, we've asked for them to put that back in for A4179 and stressed that those audio only services are really important for folks, for elderly folks, for folks that don't have access to broadband, for folks who may not have equipment that lets them use telehealth services. We've stressed that it's really important for those folks that we continue to allow for audio only services. So if you call your legislators about A4179, please ask them to put provisions to allow audio only services in there as well. And also another important thing for them to consider that I don't know if it's in, I don't think it's in the bill at this point, is I believe the way the current laws and executive orders are written, that the provisions that were put in place for state of emergency for insurance companies they're required to stay in place, I believe, for 90 days following the end of the public health emergency. So for instance, if the public health emergency were to end on June 30th, those provisions would stay in place until September. We want to make sure that any legislation that is passed that continues those provisions takes effect immediately the day that the public health emergency extension expires. The way the bills are written right now, they may not take effect until January 1st, 2022 or some other date, and we want to avoid that lapse in coverage. So if you're calling your legislators, it's very important that the provisions of A4179 that make permanent telehealth expansion take effect immediately when the provisions from the public health emergency expire without any gap in coverage. And again, I'll say it one more time, it's A4179 if you'd like to reach out to your legislators.
Thank you, Jeff.
Can I just add something to that? The other thing that I would encourage people to consider is, generally where CMS goes, the insurance companies do tend to follow. So although we're talking local in our state, New Jersey, and certainly anybody who's in another state, can address that in your state. But I think on a national level, for CMS and therefore talking to our national, our Congress people and our senators, because this is going to take a while for people to recover from. On so many levels, right? And we shouldn't have to be doing these piecemeal battles. I did read that statute, and thank you, Jeff, for letting us know what NASW New Jersey is doing, because I was noticing a couple things there. So, again, nationally, and, I find it hard to believe that they would just, at any point say no more of this, because people and businesses have invested significant amounts of money setting their services up to provide this. And it's not just social workers, but it's healthcare, doctors' offices and everything else. Even universities have, put in a lot of money to continue education, and for them to just say, let's forget about the pandemic and go back to what we were doing. I know that as a country, sometimes we like to forget about bad things, Tulsa, but we can't. And I think there's a lot that we need to continue to do to help people get through this, whether it takes a year, 2 years, or even just recognizing the reality that being able to do telehealth allows us to reach out to people who perhaps never were able to get to an agency for whatever reason, or get to a practitioner.
Yeah. And again, the reason why this is so important is the liberal use of telehealth the non-discrimination in terms of insurers paying rates for telehealth, the same as they would in-person therapy, the use of various platforms, all of this is in front of us and usable by us because of the emergency posed by COVID. Once that emergency is deemed resolved, the danger is all of this goes away. And these are very useful tools by which to help people. And we don't want that. And so it is so critical what Jeff was outlining in terms of efforts by NASW and others in this regard. I'd like to put out an idea out there, and I throw this out every time I speak relating to the challenges of COVID. It's this, and I know Jennifer is taking notes. I would like us to think about having a meeting of the profession when this is resolved, to compare notes about lessons learned, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, what can we do better going forward, what can we do better to more effectively respond to our clients' needs, our needs as professionals next time. There have been many, many valuable lessons learned by all of us. And I'd like to see NASW play a lead role in gathering those voices, gathering those perspectives, and doing some deep thinking and coming up with some recommendations as to, lessons learned, how we can do it better going forward. I think hopefully we're nearly there.
Well, I can assure you that we have been taking lots of notes, and that a meeting of the profession, at least here in New Jersey, is in the works. For those of you who are on today's conversation, we have come together yearly for our conference, and fingers crossed we'll be able to do that together this year at a hybrid event, sort of recognizing that we're all at different spaces and we're bringing that together. But I think even more globally on a national level, our colleagues in other states are really coming together and having these conversations. We as executive directors in all of our states are meeting tomorrow to talk about what this looks like and how do we provide guidance and how do we do this advocacy. And I think if this has taught us anything, it's that social workers should be leading these conversations. We should be at the tables where policies are being made. We should have been at the table when telehealth started to roll out 1 million years ago to really shape it in a way that met the needs of our profession. And I think for what it's worth, I think this has really positioned our profession to take a leadership role in a way that perhaps we just weren't positioned to, or we didn't in the past. And I look forward to all of us being involved in that conversation. I did want to go back to one of the things, we've talked a lot about telehealth and how that might be changing and insurance reimbursements rates here in New Jersey. But I do know that we have a lot of people who are perhaps licensed temporarily through the actions at our state and might be living in North Carolina or Texas, you name it, who hold that temporary license that was available. Or perhaps you're a clinician and you are temporarily seeing people outside of New Jersey as well. And I think this is going to be a bit of the moving target as well, because you as a practitioner really need to be very much so connected with each one of the states that you are temporarily licensed in. At any given moment, their rules can change just as New Jersey's are, and they could lift their executive orders, making temporary licenses now null and void. And we need to be really mindful that we are approaching a point in this journey that these executive orders could start to go away. These states of emergencies are likely to be lifted at some point in the nearer future, at least nearer than where we were a year ago when we started these conversations. And what does that mean for your clients? And thinking through, if you will decide to go through with licensure in that state, a permanent licensure, what does that mean for you as a practitioner? Making sure that you know the CE standards, making sure that you've started that process if indeed you want to do that. But then also understanding their rules and regulations. Many states require that you be physically in the state where your client is located. And if that's not going to be possible for you, making sure that you're able to communicate that with your clients now. We are as a profession working on an interstate licensing compact, we are at the very formative itty bitty like nugget stages. I don't want anyone to be disillusioned that I think that's going to be a very long process. I think we're not looking for any sort of plan for the next couple of years. This is going to be the very beginning of that. So it's very important for you to engage with whatever states. And if you are temporarily licensed here in New Jersey, you know, there is conversation already happening about whether we are going to extend those. You know, we talked with the Department of Consumer Affairs and the licensing board last week, I believe. Jeff, you can correct me if I'm wrong. And they are starting to think about when is it appropriate for these licenses to be phased out, and what will be the requirements in New Jersey, given that this is a licensing year? Will they be requiring proof of active and good standing licensure in the other states of which you are practicing? Will you be required to earn some amount of continuing education credits here in New Jersey? As we all know, New Jersey has some of the strictest regulations in continuing education in the nation. So there are a lot of things to think about, and just, you know, how you're going to continue to see clients in multiple states. And I know that's a big challenge for the profession.
Yeah, Jen, you're 100% right about that. We had that call with DCA last week, and that is pretty much what they have said. They are considering some additional limited extensions just to protect continuity of care. But just to follow up, if anybody on this call is currently practicing in New Jersey under the emergency temporary graduate LSW license or the emergency temporary out-of-state license, make sure that you are initiating the full regular licensure process in New Jersey as soon as possible, if you haven't already, to make sure you can continue to practice in the state once those temporary programs expire.
The other
We did
thing
have
you
a
should
couple.
do,
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
just a quick add to that. The other thing that you should do if you're, you're doing out of state, and as things change, you need to be also checking in with your insurance company, the one that insures you for malpractice and liability and all that, to make sure that they will continue to extend your coverage out of the state that you're in. So it's a combination of licensure and whether it's within the scope, but also that insurance will cover out of state.
That's a great point. Oh, Dave, yep.
Yeah, stream of consciousness, Chris mentioned insurance. And another aspect is just think about going forward, the degree to which your practice is going to continue to use lots of therapy. Is that going to be the major modality? Is it going to be exceptional? And just looking forward, then look at your professional liability policy and make sure that the limits for telehealth reflect the degree to which you're using telehealth in your private practice.
Absolutely. There are a couple of questions that also came in regarding whether you could see clients in New York, et cetera. If you are seeing any clients in any state that is not New Jersey where you are licensed, you absolutely unequivocally have to be licensed in some way, shape, or form in that state. I don't know all the rules and the regulations for each one of those states. New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, all of the tri-state, you'd think that we would have very similar rules and regulations. We do not. So the best and absolute best answer is to look on their websites for the licensing boards in those individual states of which you might or be interested in practicing in, or call the NASW offices in that state. Or for New York City, you'd want to call the New York City office of NASW. They can certainly help answer those questions and point you to the right people. We want to make sure that you are practicing responsibly and legally in each one of those states. A couple of other questions, just housekeeping stuff that I can answer really quickly. We will continue to keep you updated as the changes in licensure and temporary license status and all of those things start to unfold here in New Jersey. You should stay on the lookout. Typically they come out as a message from me directly. So hope we try to flag those in a different way rather than burying them in newsletters, which are fantastic. I hope you're reading them all, but we want to make sure that they're front and center. It would be lovely to hear from a few of you who haven't had your questions answered. I'm trying to keep up to date in the chat room. But if you have a question that we have not yet answered, and that is also not specific to your individual situation, that is a more generalized question for returning to in-person practice, and you want to raise your yellow hand, we will be able to call on a few of you and maybe unmute you for questions. That would be great. Love to hear some community engagement. So please, I'm going to ask Jeff, et cetera, to help keep an eye on that. But I have Shirley, and I'm going to unmute you or ask you to unmute yourself, Shirley, and have you ask your question. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to clarify, I'm trying to keep up with taking notes. There's a lot of information. The part where employers can ask employees their vaccination status, and it was suggested to keep those cards in a separate area. What happens with private practice clinicians? You mentioned that we can ask status, but we can't go further into it. If a client says, yes, I was vaccinated, can we ask for cards? Should we be asking?
I'll answer that. Yeah, the executive orders I've seen provide explicitly for your asking for cards. And by the way, if somebody is not vaccinated for whatever reason, and again, we're not delving into the reasons why, but it's okay to ask for vaccination status. It's okay to require proof of that being a vaccine card. Keep that on file. If the answer is no, then it's up to you to make a reasonable accommodation of that individual if possible. And this is not unique to this COVID issue. It's kind of a workplace reasonable accommodation concept, applies to all manner of things. To wit, if you can have the employee working, doing teletherapy, or hours on a weekend or an evening when no one else is around, those would all fall under the heading of reasonable accommodation. Only if a reasonable accommodation would be made would you then be able to say, no, sorry, you can't work here.
And for clients, the other thing that I would add is that the accommodation, in addition to telehealth, and I've seen this, I've also kind of gone through what the American Psychological, American Counseling Association, the other professional organizations are also recommending. And, the possibility, especially now, that the accommodation, if you can do this in kind of assure confidentiality and privacy, is to meet with a client outside. That there's nothing that says you can't do that. It just, you have to make sure that it's confidential and private, not on your front lawn where everybody, can see you or whatnot. So that's another way of kind of making accommodation for somebody who is not vaccinated for whatever reason. Outdoors is a little bit better, with the virus being, forget the term that they use, but watered down, so to speak, keeping a distancing or whatever. So there are things that you can do. What you have to show is that you made efforts to provide a reasonable accommodation.
Shirley, does that answer your question?
I had
Still muted. That's okay.
There we go. Yes, thank you so much. Sorry. Thank you very much.
The joys of Zoom.
Remember that what's on the card, what's on the card is most information that we might already get anyway, so the card itself, although you don't want to be putting that all over Facebook, there's some of that information we get when we take insurance cards and the like. So
Joel, I see that you have your hand raised. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I was also taking notes, and I just had one question to clarify as well. You were mentioning about the contacting your malpractice insurance carrier and whether that claim would be covered out of state. And I was wondering if you could just clarify that, because whether the claim would be covered or whether the incident would, so I was just needing clarification about that.
Your insurance company will cover social work that's deemed to be within the scope of practice in your state. Many of the policies talk about scope of practice in the state of New Jersey, right? And so if you're providing services kind of outside, you should be talking to your policy carrier about that.
Okay, thank you.
You know, if you want to, let's say, practice in New Jersey and New York, you know, then you just ask your insurance company to extend your scope, that you have authorization, your license is recognized, you have permission or whatever. Just make sure everybody's on the same page. And insurance companies love to have information in advance so that they can advise you before you actually do something, but then they have to kind of sweep up, so to speak. So, you know, I get a lot of calls sometimes. People will call me and tell me, this is what I did. Am I in trouble? You know, and at that point, if they did it and they're in trouble, there's not much that I can do. So, you know, I always encourage people, if you have a question, you know, if there's a potential for malpractice or something, call the insurance company, let them guide you. And, you know, then they'll take it from here. They'll say you're good or what, you know, or go back to the lawyer or whatever. And they don't, you know, if you make a phone call to them, they don't raise your rates just for making a phone call. They actually like that.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to call on someone else live in just a moment, but I did see a message in the chat room I wanted to just bring us back to. Gretel is looking for any guidance for those of social workers who are making home visits, holding sessions in client's house. They do plan to go hybrid practice, but just wondering if you have any guidance for that return to doing home-based work.
Yeah, even if the governor, as soon as we hang up the phone with one another today, comes out and removes any ambiguity about private practice therapy, it's like every other business. You know, you can drop the mask, you can drop the social distancing, if vaccinated, and so on. You would still want to have procedures and protocols in your practice that address a variety of things. What requirements are we placing on third-party vendors that come into our offices? To the extent we go to third-party locations, home visits, what protocols are we going to follow? Are we masking up? Are we requiring that our clients at their homes or third-party locations be masked, be vaccinated? Along similar lines, if you have a large practice, you know, you want to make sure that your employees are treated the same, that they aren't discriminated against because they've chosen to be masked or not to be masked. You know, there are a lot of management issues that go with this concept. And again, even once social work practices are deemed just like every other business, open for business, you, the practice owner, can require more stringent standards. You could require that everybody that comes in here needs to be masked. So it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. That's why we all get the big money, right, Dave?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, you know, as far as I know, DCP&P workers are not going to homes on a regular basis yet. Judges are not holding open court yet, no matter what they do on All Rise and other TV shows. You know, it's in the works, but it's going to be a slow progress. And I agree. I mean, you know, I think about it because I'm starting to do more elder law. I want to do more elder law. And so that's going to require more home or meeting elsewhere because I have stairs. And, you know, I find that I'm, you know, my thoughts are is that I'm going to be wearing a mask for a while, I went to the supermarket the other day. I wore a mask. So I look at kind of each situation and looking at the risk to me, to others. And I think not just to me, but if I'm going to be working with elderly, I'm going to be wearing a mask. Okay. If I'm working with sick people, I'm going to be wearing a mask because, there's that possibility that I could have it and I'm not going to risk transmitting it to somebody else. And as I saw somebody talk about, wearing face shields and, masks or whatever, you explain to the client, I'm wearing this for your protection and my protection because I can't guarantee that I don't have anything and I want to make sure you're protected. Okay. It's not discrimination.
I agree. And there's a couple of questions that have come in terms of just wanting some clarity about when do we expect to be able to return to in-person maskless sections. And the truth is, we do not know. We do not know. And we want to make sure that we're being very clear that that guidance has not been given without ambiguity by the governor's orders. And I think one of the things that we as a profession really have to balance is that we understand again that it is really frustrating that gyms and hairdressers and all of these places are open up. And I was there this weekend, so I saw it all. I was the only one probably still wearing a mask, even though I'm vaccinated, and I'll probably still just go about doing my mask business because my family didn't get colds this year because of them. So we just might be always masked. And there's still some ambiguity about what we should be doing as professionals in our private practices. But we do consider ourselves as healthcare professionals as a profession. And if healthcare professionals right now are being, asked to continue to keep masks on in healthcare settings, that might be just something to consider right now, that we sort of fall into that category. As soon as we hear more information from the governor or clarity about what that looks like, we will certainly communicate it. But I wanted to make sure that we came back to a couple of those messages in my box. Crystal, I do see that you have your hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and ask for you to unmute yourself. Welcome, Crystal.
Hi, that's actually, my question goes along with yours, but is specific to children. And if your clients are children, is there any overlap between the governor's rules and mandates that apply to schools and private practice with children? So like if mask mandates get lifted at schools, is that a good indication that we should kind of are able to follow that, or should we be looking for somewhere else than what's happening in schools?
Crystal, I would say you should look for guidance on that, not to the schools, but to your professional organization. NASW New Jersey will be able to communicate the all clear signal more precisely than trying to interpret what the schools do or don't do.
It's hard with schools, like, and whenever you're working in a host organization, whether that be the schools, courts, jails, because they do have their own rules and regulations. And we know that schools are getting a lot of pressure from parents. We know that, to get back to normal, my kids, my grandson's upstairs doing tele-school and he hates it. So we know that they're getting a lot of pressure. So they're going to have their own policies. All right. But as a school social worker, and, NASW does have, guidelines for school social workers that you can get on their website that recognizes that you're caught in the middle as a school working in a school. Okay. So if they lift the mandates, you'll still look at what is required for social workers, and also, again, what you think is safest for you and your students that you're going to be working with. I wish I couldn't, I wish I could say that people won't get mad at you for wearing a mask, but we know that there are people who, for some reason, feel offended when people wear masks, even when they don't have to. But you have to do what you think, again, is the safest and most reasonable for you and your students, your clients.
Crystal, just show of hands, you can answer your question, not answer. Okay, great. again, if anyone else has questions, you're certainly welcome to raise your little yellow Zoom hand, and we will bring you up on screen in the last couple of minutes that we have got together. A couple of people have asked, and I want to be careful about how we respond to this. You know, does being fully vaccinated mean that you can't pass COVID on to your clients? Isn't that why we're getting vaccinated, et cetera? I'm not sure if Chris or David, you want to respond to that, or certainly I can as well.
I'll only say that I'm fully vaccinated. I got vaccinated as early as I could, but I also recognize that, you know, I've been told that it's 97%. Okay. And so and I again go by what I've read, what I've heard, keeping up with the science, that, you know, there are possibilities that even with being fully vaccinated, you could be carrying without knowing it. And therefore, there is that possibility that 3% or whatever one you got, you know, there's that possibility. So I feel it's my professional duty to minimize risk.
Ditto.
Yep, it's absolutely, it's a complicated issue, and it's difficult. There's no right or wrong. It's time to take off your mask. It's not time to take off your mask. I think the best that we can do as a profession is, you know, take into consideration our own risks and our families and our clients, and try to make the best you know, decisions that we possibly can. And certainly while we're waiting for more guidance from the governor's office, you know, we will continue to push for more guidance and some clarity around that. But reasonableness is perhaps the name of today's conversation.
Yeah. I mean, look, when Mary Richmond didn't, I don't know if she thought about a pandemic when she was coming up with the all her first, but certainly, you know, whether it's 1950 or 1996 or we did not anticipate a pandemic when we wrote our code of ethics. Okay, there's nothing in the code, there's no section 7 at this point that says in the event of a pandemic this is what we should do, you know. And what we can do is look at all the latest information and come up again with what we think is the most reasonable from an ethical point of view, from a legal point of view, from a personal point of view. You know, this is why in school we teach critical thinking, because the answers are not always out there in black and white for everything. So
I'd add on to what Chris said, in that a few years back, I had the privilege of chairing NASW's National Ethics Committee. And I was involved with luminaries like Dr. Rick Reamer, Dr. Alan Barsky, Dr. Kim Straub-Gottlieb, and others in kind of tweaking our code of ethics to address technology changes. And I'm sure glad we did, because it gave us some degree of guidance. Little did we know that, you know, this tinkering was going to be front and center because of the COVID epidemic. Had we that foreknowledge, maybe we would have done more. Maybe, going back to the point I made previously, given our experiences, maybe one of the things we might want to look at again are further tweaks to the use of technology in our practices warranted based upon our collective experience. What worked really well, what could work better. So there's all kinds of directions we can take lessons learned for the betterment of our clients, for the betterment of our practices.
yeah. And I'm hoping that NASW will also be having a, you know, at the national level. Unfortunately, we missed Dawn today, who could speak for where the national office is. Again, we're talking about what we know today. This is an ever-changing, growing, moving target kind of topic. And so what we know today may be different tomorrow. We just got to show that we're doing what we can do with the latest knowledge.
Absolutely. And Dawn just sent me an email to say she was caught up on a personal matter and sincerely apologizes for not being able to make it today. but we certainly understand how that goes. This is an ever-changing situation. And, I think a year ago, we started the conversation about reopening only to find ourselves sitting in some form of quarantine for the next 365 days. So we invite you to stay connected with us, to continue to join these conversations, because as the benchmarks change, as the rules change, as our, the whole landscape of how we navigate changes, we're going to continue to bring people together to have the conversations to figure out how we navigate this together. I sincerely appreciate your time today, David and Chris, in joining us and leading this conversation. I do know that there were some outstanding questions from the audience, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but we will try as best we can to answer those in supplemental facts and tip sheets on our website. As always, we encourage you to reach out to us for ethics consultations. As a member of NASW, you have access to free help in navigating some of these ethical considerations. We invite you to call and take advantage of that. And also our free pro bono legal 10-minute question. So David serves as one of our pro bono attorneys, as do a number of other phenomenal New Jersey-based attorneys. So if you have questions about what you should be doing, or forms and waivers and things of that nature, we invite you to connect with us, and we'll be able to connect you with an attorney to answer some of those questions. If you have other questions, you are welcome to email us. Our contact information is on our website, and we invite you to do so. It helps shape the community conversations that we bring to you, and also the information that we share on our social media and on our website, just creating more tools for you. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Super grateful for your time and your thought leadership, and we look forward to having more community conversations together. Thank you all.
Jennifer, thank you, and NASW New Jersey for the leadership you've shown on this. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Jen. And I look forward to future conversations. I see a lot of questions here that we weren't able to get to. So as you said, hopefully they'll be addressed in the future, because they are important and helpful.
Absolutely. More to come. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.